Hi. Um, this is a miniature lecture on Rita Weems and the article that I asked you to read about biblical interpretation and her way of interpreting the Bible. So let me see. Let's share screen. And let's see, how do I get this to start? There it is. I think that should do it. There we go. So this is on Renita Weems and biblical interpretation. And this is a great picture of Renita Weems on her bicycle. And you know me, and I love bicycles. So I wanted to share that one with you. So this is the title of her article that we're reading is called Reading Her Way Through the Struggle, Biblical Interpretation. So Renita Weems is ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal tradition. And here's a picture of her. She was the first African American Hebrew Bible scholar with a PhD from Princeton. So I think that's pretty amazing, an amazing accomplishment for her. She is June 26th, so that makes her Cancer, and if anybody's interested in astrology. She taught at Vanderbilt. She was there at Vanderbilt when I was there for a year, but our paths did not cross. I didn't get a chance to take a class with her, but I did see her in the hallways, and I did get to hear her lecture. She also taught at Spelman and American Baptist College. Her dissertation focused on marriage imagery in the Hebrew prophets, focusing largely on the books of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Hosea. Now, the article that I asked you to take a look at is about how to read and engage the authority of the Bible and different interpretive approaches. Now, the ways we read the Bible and engage the Bible, it varies according to our tradition, the tradition that we come from. It varies in terms of our context. It varies in terms of what our theological commitments are, our values, and our strategic goals. And some of those things are things we're kind of stuck with, and some of those things are those factors are shaped and reshaped as we uncover some of our embedded theological assumptions, and as we grow and change in our own theological commitments in our own communities that we are involved in and that we are responsible to, as well as our own strategic goals. And Renita Weems constructs an approach for engaging the Bible from the perspective and context of African American women. So she's focused mostly on how can she help African American women, and particularly she's looking at African American laity and how they can engage the Bible in a way that can be a meaningful resource for persons from any marginalized community in shaping their modern existence, but she's particularly interested in African American women. Her approach negotiates the social literary universe of the Bible as paradigmatic of a liberationist and liberated hermeneutic. That's a quote from her article. In terms of looking at biblical authority, which is the question that we're engaging for today, or one of the questions we're engaging for today, she lists several different approaches to interpreting the Bible and how to engage the Bible for the purpose of edification, for theology, and for formulating norms for behavior for African American women. She highlights the complexity, and sometimes there are competing and conflictual strategies and conflicting interpretations for reading the Bible. People have different reasons for reading the Bible. People have different ways of using or engaging with the Bible, either in worship or in personal biblical study or in communal biblical study, and in doing theology, which is one of the things that we're focused on primarily, is how do we engage the Bible as an authoritative text for us constructing, creating, critiquing our own theological commitments and claims, and thus how we play that theology out. Now, Weems argues against many of the approaches to biblical scholarship that we've examined earlier, and particularly those that highlight objectivity try to look at the original context or the original meaning or function of a biblical passage, story, book, or tradition. She argues against those approaches that also argues against the approaches that follow the church's tradition of engaging the stories, passages, and themes from the Bible for the purpose of how it functions in worship and how it can be used in sermons. Now, you recall, I want you to put this in context, because this is a different approach than, say, maybe Williamson has. Now, recall the various approaches to biblical interpretation. So the one of them, and this is a main one that a lot of theologians and ministers have engaged with in the past couple of centuries, and that is the historical critical method. And that has in it a whole bunch of different ways of approaching the text. So it's looking at what the text meant, but all of them have what they have in common is that they're looking to see what did the text mean and how did it function in it originally, when it was written down or when it was created, and how it was used originally, and then when it was written down and how it continued to function from either 3,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. So some of the texts we have, they're oral traditions. So we have to look at how did they function as oral traditions before they got written down. So for example, Paul's letters are not oral traditions. They're written down. I mean, he speaks them, but they're written down and sent. And then they function kind of orally by being read to the community. Whereas stories about the creation of the world originally are stories that are told orally and passed down orally and are shared at different times. Here's the beginnings of time. Here's the beginnings of how we understand how our place in relation to the creation of the world and God's purpose in the world. So we have to consider those things as well. Another method, and by the way, the historical critical method has a variety of different foci. So some folks will look at particular genre. They'll look at this text is lyrical, or this text is more something that was used in liturgy, like the Psalms, or this text is more trying to tell the history so you can remember who your ancestors were and what they did. Or it could be stories about here's how we know how to behave or how not to behave, or they could be metaphors for how God relates to the community at large, whether that's Israel or the church or the disciples or a particular community. Now, the next approach is the church tradition approach. And this is how the text functions and has been used in the church. So now this is what happens in the community of faith that you're involved with, and what has happened throughout its history. So for example, scripture functioned differently in the 3rd century than it did in the 14th century, and that it does in the 18th century, and that it does perhaps in many communities and churches today. And even that, there's a variation across church communities as well. But the main point here is the approach to scripture as it is used heuristically to teach and to preach, homiletically as well. The third is an approach based on tradition, and this is the canonical approach. It looks at how a story or a particular text or passage or pericope fits into the whole canon and its consistency with other stories, claims, and values. So, for example, you might have a variant text that talks about something that other parts of the Bible don't really spend much time talking about. And so you wonder, well, how does that fit? I mean, is it kind of something that was particularly going on at that time that it was written, or is this something that is a theme throughout the biblical texts? And you might take a look at, well, here's a theme, here's something that people are dealing with at a certain time in history, in Israel, for example, in the history of Israel, and then later on it doesn't really become that important, or it's only kind of continued on as we are doing this in remembrance of our ancestors and what they've gone through, for example. And this is one of the advantages, I think, to canonical criticism is it helps us think about a story or a passage in the context of the whole biblical scripture itself, and how important is it and how does it function. And I think that's helpful when we're looking at, sometimes small passages get taken out and highlighted, and people make a big deal about them. For example, we might take a look at the ways in Leviticus that that a man should not lie down with a man. And that's taken completely out of context when it gets preached about, I believe, when it gets preached about in today's churches, when it's trying to make an argument against gay people, because it's not really about gay people. It's not really about people in same-sex committed relationships. It has to do with a particular context 5,000, 4,000 years ago, when spilling seed was, men's seed was somehow problematic because it, the way that the biology was understood and the way that the goal, or one of the goals in the early Israel's life, was to make more Jews. And the best way to make more Jews is to have a lot of heterosexual sex with people you're married to, who are going to produce children that are going to be raised as good Jews and continue to make the community larger. That's not so much of an issue right now, and so perhaps that's an odd thing to highlight, an odd, small element in the biblical stories or the biblical histories or laws, and then that gets made into a big deal, as opposed to something like love your neighbor and care for those who are less fortunate yourselves, or look to the way that persons who are marginalized are treated. Those things are themes that go out throughout the texts, all of the texts. And so the canonical approach is trying to look at those kinds of questions as well. Then there are approaches that use human sciences. So it looks at the way our human sciences, our current sciences, can help us understand what's going on with the issues in the stories. So you might take a look at the story of Cain and Abel and look at, well, what does that have to say psychologically? So rather than look at Cain and Abel as one brother killing another brother, and it focusing on why some folks evident, not some folks, but somehow there's a breach in the notion of sin, and then that gets developed theologically as this notion of sin. But perhaps it could also be taken to look at how psychologically, how there's rivalry between siblings, and how sometimes that's related to the way that a parent or an authority figure values something that child brings, or doesn't value it. Anyway, the fifth approach, and this is the approach that Renita Weems takes herself, and it is the contextual approach. And this is such as liberation theology or feminist theology. And the questions here are to look at, how has this text been misused to reinforce the oppression that was going on at the time or that's going on now, and how it could be used to highlight the importance of liberation. So there's some texts that can be used to highlight the problems that have happened. And then there's other texts that can be used to highlight the way that liberation is really important, and that it's significant in the biblical text itself to listen to the voice of the unheard and the underrepresented. And liberation theology in itself looks to try to uncover some of the voices that, or some of the themes of what's not said about or what those persons who are not represented or underrepresented might say or respond or be saying or be responding that the text is perhaps addressing. So sometimes you get a text that's prohibiting. So for example, Paul is saying women shouldn't speak in church. Well, first there's a context of what's happening. And we don't actually know what the context is, but we do know this. If there's a prohibition against it, it means it was happening, but that isn't talked about. We don't know. We don't get to hear what was being said. What were the women saying? What were they trying to institute? Why were the authority figures, the people who had the power, trying to keep them quiet? We don't know. At any rate, so I mean, that's the liberation theology or feminist theology wants to uncover what the text might reveal about what's going on in that context, in that situation, and see how it can be helpful for us today. Now, Renita Weems goes further to suggest that instead of any of these various approaches that I've just mentioned, so she does follow the liberation theology in general, but instead of the other approaches that I've mentioned, she suggests a different approach. Now, she also doesn't want to simply reject the Bible as an authoritative source for religious knowledge, but rather she's suggesting that we could take a look at the portions of the Bible that are central for grasping God's liberating activity and allow these portions to become the norm. Remember, we talked about critical norms, and a norm is something that is a criteria by which you judge other stories and histories, claims, letters, and commands. Note that's similar to the contextual approach mentioned that we've mentioned above. The contextual approach that I just was talking about. She suggests that African-American women hold a creative tension in their engagement with the biblical stories and texts, while identifying the often complex and competing identities and communities to which they are accountable. So in other words, there's a tension for African-American women that she's suggesting, and that is that taking a look at the biblical stories in their texts, at the same time looking at the variety of different communities or commitments that they have personally or individually. So I might be a woman who has a commitment. If I'm an African-American woman, I have a commitment to a community of an African-American church. I might also have a commitment to the liberation of women. I might also have a commitment to persons who are concerned about the care of others, because maybe I'm a nurse, or I'm someone that's in the caring profession, maybe a psychologist or social worker. So you have these, sometimes they're competing and sometimes they kind of come together, these identities and these complexities of the communities to which you're accountable. And so what the point here is that she's focused on how does text, how do we read the text in terms of what it says to and how it could be meaningful for and practical for the communities that we're living in now, rather than looking at what it said originally or trying to discern how it functioned in its originally when it was written, or when it was canonized, or when it was and how it was used in the church in the past. So I encourage you to reflect upon these questions and how her answers relate to the way you answer and address how you read and engage the Bible and its authority. Now, she's concerned particularly, and she highlights the ways that the Bible has been misused. And she reflects upon this ambiguity of the Bible's authority for persons who are in marginalized communities. For an example, she points to the way that Howard Thurman was influenced by his grandmother's response to the way that slave owners justified the abuse that she suffered by a misuse of a passage from Paul's letter to the Ephesians about slaves, be obedient to your masters. And Paul actually makes an argument that is trying to spiritualize that text. But at any rate, so it was misused. This particular text was misused. And so she refused to listen to anything that Paul wrote or was in the Pauline body of work. We see this in Thurman's theology as well. You can see that was influential for him. And we see that there's a focus in much African-American theology to focus not what on Paul says about anything, but to focus on the Gospels themselves and what Jesus does, and as well as the prophets from the Hebrew scripture. Now, Weems delineates the traumatic impact that this had on Thurman's grandmother and a whole generation, which in turn impacted generations following, such that the whole of the Pauline corpus is discredited. She concludes that all authoritative texts are read from the eyes of a dominant meaning-making machine, and that any norm coming from their interpretation must be questioned. So I encourage you to reflect upon the detrimental effects of any misuse of the Bible for one's own purposes, or for the purposes of those persons who have the most power, whether that's the priest or the pastor or a biblical scholar or a community of biblical scholars, and to keep it in mind as you reflect upon how you understand biblical authority, and to keep in mind the techniques that she's using that to help you uncover some of those embedded assumptions about how you've understood what the Bible is saying, and also attend deliberatively, that's a code word that you all should know what I mean by that, to the way that you use the Bible and biblical authority in your own theological reflections and constructions, and to help you not fall into that misuse. Thus, Weems is leery of any claim of a proper way to read scripture or interpret scripture, and she argues for a more free reading of the Bible, one that is based on the experience of an individual and the experience of the community to which one belongs. So she develops something that is a critical reading strategy. And strategic reading is a very important approach that she highlights and engages with and argues for, really. So in addition to taking the themes of liberation of oppressed people as the norm for appropriating themes or texts or insights that come from a text, she also calls us to be critical of the portions of the Bible in which individuals are slaughtered, subjugated, silenced, and silenced due to their identity. This could be an identity as gender, or identity as religious or ethnic, class status, race, etc., as opposed to what it is they've done or what they're doing. While she makes use of many techniques in biblical feminist scholarship, she's also critical of it when white woman's agenda is highlighted. And an example of this is the way that she interprets the story of Sarah and Hagar in terms of instead of in terms of two women who have had babies from the same Jewish man, she interprets it in terms of a white woman against a Black woman. And she develops this interpretation of the story to reinforce her own experience that white women share, while white women share in the oppression based on gender, white women and Black women are not natural allies in the struggle against patriarchy. She posits the value of the Bible because it speaks to the deepest aspirations of oppressed people for freedom, dignity, and justice and vindication. She applies Malcolm X's principle, which was originally about empowering Blacks to defend themselves against anyone who tried to harm them. And she uses it or applies it to use whatever means necessary to recover the voices of the oppressed within the biblical texts. So then now, as we're coming to the conclusion here, There are two aspects of the process of deconstructing and reconstructing the Bible as an authoritative source I want you to take with you and think about as you're engaging this. So before a text that has been used or misused, I should say, to subjugate African-American women and to justify that subjugation, before that text can be used in any way that could be helpful as a resource, let alone an authoritative resource, the issues must be reviewed critically and carefully as alternative ways of engaging the Bible and a particular passage. And these alternative ways should be addressed using the following questions. One, how does and should the reader engage Scripture with attention to her own history, context, community, and hopes? And two, how can the text be used for liberation for the reader and her community with attention to how it has been misused for oppression? So I encourage you to take a look at those two questions as you're engaging biblical texts, particularly problematic biblical texts. And this is really helpful, I think, more so for sermon writing. I mean, it's helpful for doing theology as well, but it's helpful particularly for the homiletical approach to how do you deal with a text that you're given to preach a sermon on. So in conclusion, she's engaging the liberative elements of a text and engaging the text for liberation. So think about those two things: liberating elements of a text and engaging the text itself for liberation. The focus then is not on the text, but it's on the reader's social and ethnic context and her own experience, needs, and hopes. Weems asserts that while most passages in the scripture are not from the perspective of the oppressed, there are elements from the underside that can be discerned. And that's part of the work of the biblical scholarship, is discern those elements. She seeks to empower all African-American women to read and engage the Bible, not just scholars, to read and engage the Bible from her own experience. That's the African-American women, I should say, from their own experience, with special attention to the work of discerning those elements that speak to the liberative elements of a text and the ways that it can be liberating for African-American women. So I encourage you to think about your own reflections on this article, and also to place those reflections in the larger context of these questions. How do you discern the meaning of a biblical passage and its assertions or claims? What is your approach to biblical interpretation in general, both as a theologian, as you're constructing your own theology, or you're looking critically on the theology that is in your tradition or your community, as well as when you're writing sermons or giving homilies? How do you understand the authority of the scripture itself? What role does it play in your theology? Is it the main source? Is it one source among many? Is it a source that uses other sources to interpret and apply it? How do you relate scripture to the other authoritative sources? So I encourage you to reflect upon those, and we will have conversation about that when we meet. Thank you very much.